Afternoon, subscribers, and in this video, this follows on of course from the Macroeconomics video, to have a look and just think about what the likely questions might be for the pending GCSE Macroeconomics paper in just a few weeks' time. Now of course I have no inside knowledge on this is just my kind of best guess as to what might appear. So what I'm going to do is, same as last time, I'll talk you through what was on the 2022 paper, talk you through what was on the 2023 paper, and then I'm going to have a little stab in the dark, really, educated guess as to what the likely topic areas might be potentially this summer. Now, of course, what I'm not saying here is simply revise everything that I think might appear. You need to know everything. And the other caveat here is, of course, whilst we're talking about the papers, what I'm not talking about the multiple choice sections of the papers. And for the multiple choice section of each paper, you need to know essentially everything which is on the specification. So with that in mind, let's get straight into it and let's delve into the 2022 macroeconomics paper and just think about the questions which were asked in that exam series. So in 2022, summer 2022, the first question was about inflation and monetary policy and the context. And of course, the context is all important because answering in context is a requirement of the actual mark scheme indeed. So the context was you were presented with data about inflation in Chile, and the kind of the commentary on that was to do with the actions of the central bank as well in Chile. So I'm sure in your lessons you talk a lot about the Bank of England and what the Bank of England does, but here you're asked to apply that knowledge that you've learned there, but apply it in a different context, and that context was Chile. And the other important thing to note there was that they focused on quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing, A, it's quite a difficult thing conceptually to get your head around, but B, it doesn't actually get a lot of coverage within your textbook. But in spite of that, it was quite a major component of this particular kind of context and the data that went alongside it. So questions that you had to consider were, you had to interpret the data. I can't remember exactly what the data was, but I imagine it was a set of data about inflation going from, let's say, 10% to 5%. Now, what most people would say would be, of course, who are less educated than yourselves, they'd say, oh, well, that means that prices are falling. You, of course, know that it means that prices are rising at 5 miles an hour instead of 10 miles an hour, or 5% instead of 10%. So you just need to keep that in mind when you are looking at the data about inflation. You were then asked to explain the effect of inflation on the purchasing power of money. Now, any historians, I'm sure among you, will be aware that inflation erodes the purchasing power of money. If you've got £100 in your pocket, one week something's £20, you can buy 5 of them. For the next week it's 25, you can only buy 4. So inflation will erode the purchasing power. How the central bank responds to inflation rates which are too high or too low or negative. Very important to remember that we can have inflation which is negative, i.e. deflation, of course. And you need to be aware of the central bank's response. Now in this case it was the Central Bank of Chile, but in the Bank of England, of course, you'd be thinking along similar lines. If inflation's too high, you raise the base rate. If inflation's too low, you would lower the base rate. And certainly if you were into deflation, such as Japan, for example, which has had many decades of deflationary problems essentially built into the kind of really seeping into the economy, then you need to know what the likely response is. You need to know the causes of inflation, so that's 3 for yourselves: demand pull, cost push, and monetary inflation. You're asked to calculate the real rate of interest. So remember, the real rate is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. And then the big evaluation question was to evaluate the consequences of inflation for the government. Now there's a whole section in your textbook about the consequences of inflation for different economic agents, and you need to be aware of all of those. So that was the 2022 paper, question 21. So it was the first of the big questions. The next question then moved into economic growth and fiscal policy. the context for this, again, unfamiliar to yourselves as you would expect. So you were given data for Burkina Faso and China. So Burkina Faso, very poor developing nation, and China, an economy which is transitioning, and in the last 25 years has brought, at least 1 billion people probably out of absolute poverty, certainly moving in the right direction. You're also given statistics about the proportion of population in education and the proportion of males and females in education particularly. And you then had to identify the data, so trends, calculate GDP per capita. Now I think if you look across the micro and the macro papers, you'll find that most of the calculate questions do appear on the macro side of the course rather than the micro side. So important to have a calculator obviously in the exam. You're asked to analyse the importance of education for economic growth. We all know how important that is in terms of occupational mobility, productivity, etc., etc. Identify other determinants of economic growth. So again, straightforward kind of regurgitation of facts from your textbook. And then the evaluate question here was the extent to which economic growth brings social and economic benefits to an LDC, a less developed economy. Quite a lot in that really. Difficult to get your head around, maybe just even looking at the question, economic growth, the social and economic benefits that it brings alongside of it. And that's an evaluate question, so of course that requires advantages and disadvantages, etc. And then the third question was with regard to the one which I always kind of hope that this won't appear on the exam for you, because I know it's really difficult, but you can see here as we go through this, you'll see that it always appears, and the reason it always appears is because the exam board know that you found it difficult, so why wouldn't they put it on? They keep testing this. So the current account balance and the balance of payments, it's not, if you really get stuck into it, you'll obviously get better at it, but conceptually it's a difficult thing to get your head around. The exchange rate obviously is linked quite nicely into that, and the export demand, import demand then also has an impact on the exchange rates, as you will know. So you were given data about the UK's current account balance, and that was compared with data for the USA and Germany. Now you will know obviously that the UK hasn't had a current account surplus for about 40 years, probably a little bit more. You were asked to identify trends within the data, compare the data, and then analyse the UK's widening current account deficit. Now, of course, please don't confuse the current account with your bank account. Your current account at the bank is a different thing entirely. As you know, we're talking the value of exports relative to the value of imports. That's our current account. You'll know the 4 components, I hope, of the current account balance: trading goods, trading services, your current transfers, and your investment income. Sometimes those last 2 are referred to as primary and secondary finance as well. So you'll know all of that. You're asked to do some calculations about percentage changes. Now percentage changes, if I gave you this in a maths paper, I'm sure 100% of you would probably get it right. But as soon as you encounter a question on percentage changes in an economics paper, everything seems to go to pot. You need to just make sure that you carry your mathematics knowledge into the paper, and just because it's economics, it doesn't make it all of a sudden 10 times more difficult just because you sit in an economics paper. And the evaluate question: should the UK government try to eliminate the deficit? Now, given that we've had a current account deficit for so long, the obvious answer is, well, it's probably not essential for a country like us to eliminate the current account deficit. You need to know what the pros and cons are of that. America, of course, carries an enormous current account deficit, as you well know. But you might want to then relate it back to your case study, where a country like Burkina Faso, it would be in its interest potentially to reduce the current account deficit for all manner of reasons, which we're not going to get into here because that's not the purpose of this video. But you need to just have that in mind. So that was 2022. In 2023, started off with economic growth. So, we had economic growth question 2 in 2022. Then in 2023, we have economic growth kicking off. So it's economic growth in the UK and Japan. So one familiar context for you, the UK, one unfamiliar, Japan. You're given data for both countries, GDP and GDP per capita, and you're asked to interpret it, calculate it. Now, if you've already watched my microeconomics video, you'll know that in the microeconomics section of the paper, you don't really get asked to do much by way of calculation, but you can see this is quite calculate heavy in that regard. So calculate the UK's GDP, so a percentage change question. Fiscal policy, so government spending and taxation. And then the essay question on that, to what extent are the benefits of using fiscal policy to achieve economic growth greater than the costs? So how would you achieve economic growth with fiscal policy? So it's going to be an expansionary fiscal policy. What does that mean? It means G is bigger than T. What are the implications of that? Obviously, if you generate growth, it's good, but obviously there's all sorts of borrowing has to go on in order to finance that. So those are the sort of things that you'd be talking about there. The second question was about exchange rates and interest rates. So we had a question over here previously, in the previous session, the year before, on exchange rates. Here we've got another one on exchange rates, but slightly coming at it at a slightly different angle because we're talking about interest rates. So we had a bilateral exchange rate chart. So bilateral, of course, I just mean one currency against the other. So pound against the US dollar, something like that. You're asked to convert values from pounds to US dollars in the same way. You know, you go on your holiday, converting the amount of pounds that you sell in order to purchase a given amount of dollars. So that's a similar transaction. You're asked to interpret the impact on sales. So that's all to do with, as I keep hammering home to my year 11 students at the moment, the way to remember this is, if the exchange rate appreciates, then export prices also go up, therefore demand, typically, ceteris paribus, would fall. And of course, imports are the flip side of the same coin. If export prices are going up, import prices are going down. What does that mean? It means demand, ceteris paribus, will be increasing. What did you have to do in terms of analyse here? You had to analyse a cause of a fall in the value of the pound. What a gift of a question, ladies and gentlemen, on the exam. So thinking about your demand and supply diagram, we'd be thinking about either something which causes the demand curve to shift left, or something which causes the supply curve to shift right. You will know all of those, you'll be aware of all of those, because of course those are quoted within your specification. Hasn't arrived yet. Okay. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen, for the slight interruption. And you will know about those because the determinants of exchange rates are quoted within your spec. To what extent do higher interest rates impact those other than people buying houses, was the question. Now, let me just take that off. To what extent do higher interest rates impact those other than buying houses? Now, please do not be like I remember feeding back to staff across lots of different schools about this paper just in recent months, actually. And unfortunately, candidates, and my own included, when they did sort of a practice paper using this paper, they did not read the question, and so they simply talked about the impact of interest rates on people buying houses, rather than the impact on the people not buying houses. Now, as a consequence of not answering the question, you obviously don't get any marks, so you've got to be really careful, read the question. And then the final one, globalization of the US economy. It's something that my year 11s have been really doing a lot, weeks and weeks and weeks, we've been focusing on this. The context was the US balance of trade. I said earlier, didn't I, that I always hope that there isn't a question on the current account. Why? Because it's difficult. And what happens? It's here in 2022, current account. It's here in 2023, balance of trade question. Therefore, is it more than likely that it will appear this year? Potentially yes, because the exam board know it's a difficult topic. This one was interesting because you had to calculate the balance of, so you had to calculate items on the current account balance. Then you had to talk about the benefits associated with free trade areas. So you'll know, of course, as a result of Brexit, we have left a free trade area called the European Union. Well, you need to know about the advantages and disadvantages of the free trade areas. We were asked whether or not we could see globalization in the data. Now, what they were actually looking for was you needed to analyze the numbers, and you should have seen rises and falls in imports and exports, and that's an indicator to you that there's more globalization because there's more world trade taking place. Driving factors of globalization, what are they? Standard textbook things, technology, transportation, etc. And then evaluate the extent to which globalization benefits US producers. And that was it. Now, I think, and of course, as I say, I'm going to repeat myself here again, but I'm not saying, and I've no inside line on this, I do not know that these are the topics that are going to appear in a few weeks' time, but I think these topic areas might be ripe for inclusion. If you think about the big macro things that have been going on in the UK and globally as a result of the pandemic and then Ukraine and Russia crisis, etc., inflation's been a real big problem, hasn't it? We were up to 11.1 just over a year ago. Now, of course, we're coming back down towards target of 2. So inflation, and the context could be, you'll have heard, I'm sure, in the last 12 to 18 months, cost of living crisis, that sort of thing. You'll have heard people talking about the fact that prices are going up faster than their wages, and that cost push inflation indeed. So maybe that could be the potential the context, and then questions might be, maybe you'll have to calculate a real income value, so you'll know the difference between nominal and real, and you'll have to calculate the difference. The impact on aggregate demand. Now, I do teach quite a lot of aggregate demand to my GCSE students, even though it's probably more of a year 12 kind of topic area rather than year 11. But nonetheless, you'll need to know what is the general impact of inflation on components of aggregate demand. So what's going to happen maybe to consumption, what's going to happen to investment by firms, what's going to happen to government expenditure, all of that sort of thing. And then what might the impact be? Now, if you look at your specification, the spec says that you need to be able to evaluate the impacts of inflation on consumers, on producers, on savers, and on the government. Now, I don't know which one of those you might have to respond to in an exam. So you'll need to, for your prep, you'll obviously need to be aware of them all. So inflation, cost of living crisis, that sort of thing, I think could be fair game for a big question. The next thing, which has not appeared, and I'm trying to think in my memory banks when this has appeared, and I'm struggling, which is why I think it might be on, the limitations of markets. So negative externalities, positive externalities, pollution, solar power, all of these positive and negative externalities has not appeared, certainly in the last 2 sessions, as you can see. So maybe the context, we've seen globally, haven't we, the rise of electric vehicles and consternation globally about, we had the kind of summits, don't we, year on year, COP, what are we on, COP24, with regard to kind of countries getting together to reduce pollution and have targets for pollution and so on. So you'll need to know maybe that could be your context, and then the various interventions, and I've just copied these straight out of your specification. So how does a tax deal with pollution? How does a subsidy encourage more electric vehicle production? Is there a role for state provision? Is there a role for legislation? Is there a role for regulation? And can we provide individuals and firms with more information as to the damage that they do when they pollute, or the benefits that vehicle owners might have when they drive more electric vehicles? This is something that can be done on information provision. So I think that's ripe for a question. And then thirdly, I think back to the quasi-quartine budget. Now, you've got to remember when these papers will be written. This paper that you're about to sit will have been written 12 to 18 months ago, probably, is when the exam board might have started planning it. And therefore, you need to think back, well, what would have been at the top of their economics agenda when they were writing the paper? Well, certainly, on the 29th of September 2022 was the Quasi budget, which, as you know, didn't go well, did it, for Liz Truss or her Chancellor of the time, Quasi. So maybe there'll be something about fiscal policy there again. Now, I know it appeared over here somewhere, it's already appeared, fiscal policy, but it could be an area which could provide a good context to get you to respond to. So you need to know obviously about your budget deficit, your budget surplus, your balanced budget, your expansionary fiscal policy, your contractionary fiscal policy, the way that you finance that by issuing bonds and so on. And then maybe, so that would be the final questions. We've got 21 on inflation, 22 on limitations of markets, 23 on fiscal policy. And I'm just throwing in here, ladies and gentlemen, you can see this one has gone beneath the red. And I'm putting in again, and the reason I'm putting it again is because it appeared here, and it appeared here, 2022 and 2023. The exam board know you don't like it, so they're more likely to include it. Current account and exchange rate. I don't think we can get away from the fact that that might yet again appear on the exam paper. So as much as I might hope that it won't appear, it's, you know, the law of averages here suggests, the law of probability suggests that it might appear once again. Anyway, I hope that's been of use, ladies and gentlemen. I would refer you to the Tutor to You revision playlists, which have been ongoing during Easter. They've been brilliant. I've learnt a few new things just from watching and tuning into those myself. So I would certainly advise that you have a look there. And yeah, I'll put a link to this spreadsheet down here somewhere in the comments. And obviously, if you've got any questions, do just drop me a line and I'll try to reply as and when. But if not, good luck. And yeah, I hope everything goes well in the summer exam series.